Thank you, Master Chief. Well done. It's now my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Rear Admiral Charles W. Ray. Rear Admiral Ray assumed his duties as Deputy Commander, U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area on June 17, 2013. Responsibilities for this assignment include oversight of U.S. Coast Guard operations for the western half of the world, divided by the Rocky Mountains. Prior to this assignment, he served as the 14th Coast Guard District Commander, responsible for U.S. Coast Guard operations from Hawaii to Guam to American Samoa and throughout Oceania. Rear Admiral Ray's previous flag assignments include service with U.S. Forces Iraq as Director of the Iraq Training and Advisory Mission for the Ministry of Interior and as the Military Advisor to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Rear Admiral Ray is from Newport, Arkansas, and is a 1981 graduate of the United States Coast Guard Academy. Admiral?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot, Mike, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to especially thank Captain Woolard and Petty Officer Jessica Martin from the base and Miss Audra Jaquez for their work. These things don't happen by themselves, and kind of the hands that do the labor, the details associated with this, we should never overlook. And so I thank you on behalf of all the participants. I want to thank the ones that traveled here from around the Bay Area, taking time out of what is the busiest season for America to come on a Saturday morning and pay tribute to those that served on that fateful day is certainly the right thing to do, and we're glad you're here. And I want to really especially recognize we got a dozen or so Naval Sea Cadets here in the back couple of rows, and if you look across the span of the last 7 decades, your legacy is carried on with these young men and women on the back rows there. I want to thank them and their leaders for being here. Thank you all very much. Most importantly, of course, we are here today to recognize the service and the sacrifice and the difference made by those men and women who served in Pearl Harbor 72 years ago, and by those who served in the following 4 years of conflict that literally changed our nation and changed the world. As was stated, it was a Sunday morning, 07:55, and the ships in Pearl Harbor were more or less going about holiday routine, and little did they know that at 07:55 they would start what would become one of the epic battles in the history of mankind. And because of you and your actions that started that day, our world would be forever changed and our nation would be forever changed. On that day, on December 7th, 1941, over 2,400 servicemen and women were killed in Pearl Harbor. Another 1,300 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet was devastated. Over 200 aircraft were ruined, shot up on the ramps at Hickam Field and Kaneohe and Bellows. And most importantly, on that day, men and women like those represented here today demonstrated that America had the resolve to overcome this and to defeat tyranny and fascism, and that our nation would rise and show that a free people could demonstrate that we would not be defeated, and that because of their commitment, the world would be a better place, as we've seen. It's worth reflecting that over 16 million American men and women served in uniform during the course of World War II. 16 million of them. And so as the years go past and there are a few of them around to hear their stories, we need to all realize what a national treasure they are. And I am so thrilled to get to meet y'all here this morning and to have you travel. I know it's not easy. I've heard some stories on some of you. It was easier than others to get out of the bed this morning. But we are all so tickled to have you here. And so I want to spend a couple minutes. I know the captain introduced him, but I want to spend a couple minutes just sharing a little bit of what the time I've learned about these. Of course, front and center, we got our Coast Guard Honorary Chief Petty Officer, Mr. George Larson. Mr. Larson served, thank you. Mr. Larson and I have something in common. We had the same address. He was there a few years before I was at Diamond Head. in Hawaii. Mr. Larson was on duty that morning as a radioman at Coast Guard radio station Diamond Head, and if you talk to him, and I encourage you to do this, he looked up overhead and saw the formations of Japanese bombers coming around. If you've been there, they kind of come around the east side of Oahu as they made their approach. There were 3 waves that bombed Pearl Harbor. Some of them came right through the middle of the Laos, and some of them came around the east, and some of them came around the west. And he saw them with his own eyes and saw what was going on. And Mr. Larson manned his duty station that day and went on to serve in the Coast Guard cutter Kukui, served in the Coast Guard cutter Taney, and served in the Coast Guard cutter Tiger throughout the duration of the war. Served with a distinction and continues to represent us well. So thank you so much, Mr. Larson, for being here today. We've got Navy Chief Petty Officer Mr. Fran Jenkins, who served in the USS Bagley. Mr. Jenkins was aboard Bagley that day. She's a destroyer that was moored at Pearl. She got underway. And I think the skipper and the XO were still ashore, and they got underway anyway, and they put out to sea. And they returned fire against the bombers and acquitted themselves well. And Bagley went on to serve throughout the Pacific. If you think of a battle in the Pacific in World War II, Bagley was there. From the Solomons to Guadalcanal to Okinawa, Bagley was there, and she earned 12 battle stars during her service. And Mr. Jenkins is joined here today by his wife of, they just met a couple of days ago, 68 years, Miss Julie Jenkins. Julie's also a veteran. She was a Navy nurse, served right up here in Mare Island, tended to our wounded, and they were married in uniform. And according to Mr. Jenkins, she outranked him at the time as a nurse, but I'm sure she still does outrank him. But we are so blessed to have you here today, and thank you for being here, Mr. Jenkins. We're blessed to have Mr. Marvin Reckner of the USS San Francisco. Marv served in San Francisco, was moored just southeast of Battleship Row, and you all, I think you know that Battleship Row was the target of the Japanese, and that was their focal point of their attack. And so being in San Francisco, which was a heavy cruiser moored just southeast on Ford Island, they were as close as you could get to being, the next part of it. And they, of course, were in a heavy maintenance period at that time, as I understand, and so they were able to return fire, and then they subsequently put to sea. And San Francisco was one of the most decorated ships of the war and acquitted herself with great distinction, and her crew in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Mr. Reckner served in San Francisco. He was back east during the time of Guadalcanal, but he served with her through the duration of the war. And once again, every battle, every place we put troops ashore, every place we had convoy duty, San Francisco served with distinction. And so did Mr. Reckner. Thank you for being here today, sir. We've also got a couple of distinguished guests. We've talked about Mr. Ganich, who's back in Honolulu today at the site of Pearl Harbor. His wife, Barbara, is here and representing his family, so we thank you for being here, Barbara. Thank you very much. And then we've got Miss Joan Earl. You see her, the Marine Corps cap over here. She wasn't in the Marine Corps in the war, but she was a child on Ford Island. And if those of you that have been to Pearl Harbor, Ford Island was where Battleship Row was. It moors up right next to it. And she was a child, and if you study the history of Ford Island, many, if not most, of the casualties of Pearl Harbor of that day, so the wounded, and there were many of them, were brought ashore to to Ford Island, and that's where they did the triage. That's where they tended to them. And as a child of 10, she lived through that, and it made an impression upon her, and so we thank her for her service as a child of a service member then, and for being part of that generation. Thank you so much. And then finally, I want to thank, I also want to thank, wait a minute, there's one other person that I met this morning. Mr. Frank Musso. Frank's over here. He was a World War II veteran and a Korea veteran. Thank you, Frank. He was, while not a Pearl Harbor survivor, Frank served with distinction throughout the Pacific in the latter part of World War II and certainly through Korea. It was the first squadron to report for duty in Korea when those hostilities started. So thank you, Mr. Musso, for being here with us today. God bless you. And then I want to thank a person I just met this morning. I don't know if I'll be able to get through this, but what a special privilege it is for us. First time at one of these ceremonies. Mr. Jack Vassar. Mr. Jack Vassar, hold those up. Y'all take a look up here. In the left hand, he's got a dog and wrench. In the right hand, he's got a flashlight. He tells me those are not the same batteries from World War II, but that's the same flashlight. But, okay, Mr. Vassar, you can relax. Thank you. Mr. Vassar served in USS Utah, and I'd encourage you to get home, Google that. The attack started at 0755 at 0801. Utah took 2 torpedoes. It's one of the first significant casualties of the war, and she subsequently rolled. And Mr. Vassar was in Utah, in main control, which those of you who don't know, that's not up topside, that's down below. Not a good place to be if your ship rolls. And he distinguished himself that day. The dog and wrench that he's got on his hand is what he tapped on the side of the ship with when he was under the water. And he worked his way to get above the waterline. The flashlight is what he used to guide his shipmates to safety. And they were subsequently brought in the equipment on that same day to cut them out, cut a hole in the side of the ship and take them out and take them to safety because of his leadership. One of just many instances of heroism, but we are so blessed to have a no-kidding Navy Cross winner, American hero with us today. So God bless you, Mr. Vassar. He doesn't have to get up. He's already stood up enough in his lifetime. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for being here. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. This is because if you've had the pleasure of going to Hawaii, if you've been, I think there's a picture on the back of the program, right, of the USS Arizona.